What if I told you that one of Buddhism's greatest saints was once a mass murderer? A young man so consumed by rage that he calls down a supernatural storm that crushes a house during a wedding celebration. 35 people die, crushed under collapsing beams and stone. But no one expected that this same killer would one day be revered as a saint, a master whose songs are still sung in Tibetan valleys today. How does someone go from taking lives to saving souls? How do you come back from that kind of darkness? Today we're telling the most shocking redemption story in Buddhist history. The tale of Milarepa, the boy who learned sorcery and became a saint. I'm warning you right now, this story gets dark before it gets light. Really dark. Are you ready to meet the saint who was once a killer? Welcome back to Buddha's Wisdom. I'm Matt, and today we're starting something completely different. You know how we recently explored the Monkey King's battle with Buddha? Well, if you thought Sun Wukong had anger issues, Milarepa makes him look like a meditation teacher. Most Buddhist stories follow a predictable pattern. Someone seeks wisdom, finds a teacher, practices meditation, achieves peace. Nice and tidy. Milarepa's story? It starts with revenge, blood, and supernatural murder. Then it gets worse. Here's why his story matters, especially if you've ever done something you deeply regret. Milarepa proves that no mistake is too big, no darkness too deep, and no past too violent for transformation. His own life shows that even a murderer can become a Buddha. His journey shows us that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about what you do after you completely mess up. Milarepa's mistake was beyond anything you can imagine. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll follow his path from sorcerer to saint. Today we're covering the darkness, the family betrayal that created a killer, and the moment everything changed. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how someone becomes so angry, they're willing to murder dozens of people with magic. But you'll also see the first spark of hope that could become enlightenment. It all started with a boy born into material prosperity and familial bliss. That's about to be destroyed forever. Our story begins in the mid-11th century, in a place called Gungtang, a prosperous region of western Tibet near the border with Nepal. Here lived a boy named Mila, which means a joy to hear. His early life was exactly that, pure joy. His father, Sherab Gyaltsen, wasn't your average Tibetan farmer. This guy was a successful merchant, the kind of man who owned vast fields, herds of yaks and sheep, and a 3-story stone mansion with carved wooden balconies. We're talking serious money here, the kind that makes you village royalty. His mother, Nyangsa Kargyen, was known throughout the region for her intelligence and beauty. She came from an influential family herself, so this marriage combined 2 powerhouses. Young Mila had everything a child could want: loving parents, a beautiful home, and a little sister named Peda Gonki, who followed him everywhere with sparkling eyes. In Tibet, household wealth and honor were everything. Losing both meant not just poverty, it meant shame that stuck to your name for generations. But here's what made this family special. They weren't wealthy jerks. Sherab Gyaltsen was respected because he was fair and generous. He helped struggling farmers through harsh winters, settled disputes with wisdom that impressed village elders, and was considered a pillar of the community. The villagers would nod respectfully when the family passed. Children would bow to Mila's father. Merchants would seek his advice on trade routes and fair prices. For 7 years, Mila lived in this bubble of security. He thought this was how life worked. You had family, you had wealth, you had respect. He had no idea that life could be cruel, but then everything changed in a single devastating week. Sherab Gyaltsen fell ill with a fever that wouldn't break. His strong body, which had survived mountain winters and dangerous trade expeditions, began to waste away before their eyes. In those days, there were no hospitals, no medicine, no way to fight whatever was consuming him from within. As he lay dying, knowing his time was running out, Sherab Gyaltsen made a decision that would doom his family. He called his brother and sister-in-law to his bedside. "Promise me he whispered with his final breaths. "You'll protect my wife and children. Guard my wealth for my son until he comes of age. Treat them as you would your own family." His brother clasped his hand and swore sacred oaths. His sister-in-law wept and promised faithfully to honor his wishes. They looked him in the eye and lied. When Sherab Geltson died, 7-year-old Mila thought his uncle and aunt would keep their promise. He was about to learn that some people will do anything for money, even destroy a family. The transformation began the day after the funeral. Mila's uncle and aunt didn't waste time. The uncle moved into the family mansion like he owned it. Because suddenly, he did. "We need to manage the estate properly," the uncle announced to the gathered villagers. For the boy's own good, of course. The villagers nodded. It seemed reasonable, responsible even. What the villagers didn't see was what happened behind closed doors. First, the uncle took control of the fields, then the livestock, then the servants. Within weeks, everything that belonged to Mila's family now belonged to his uncle. But here's the truly evil part. The uncle and aunt didn't kick the family out. That would have been too obvious. Instead, the uncle turned Mila, his mother, and little sister Pita into servants in their own home. When I first heard this story, I couldn't believe it. Yesterday, you're the son of the richest man in the village. Today, you're scrubbing floors for the people who stole everything from you. Mila's mother went from being the lady of the house to washing clothes by the river. This proud, intelligent woman was forced to bow her head and serve the very people who destroyed her life. Little Pita went from playing with silk dolls to hauling water buckets that were too heavy for her small hands. The light slowly faded from her eyes as she watched her family's dignity crumble. As for Mila himself, years later, he described it like this: "Our food was food for dogs. Our work was work for donkeys, forced to toil without rest. Our limbs became cracked and raw, with only poor food and clothing. We became pale and emaciated. It's impossible to imagine. Your own relatives, making you live like an animal. But the worst part wasn't the physical suffering, it was the humiliation. Every day, villagers would see this once proud family reduced to beggars in their own home. And slowly, the villagers' sympathy turned to indifference. People have their own problems. Family disputes become uncomfortable. It's easier to look away. Meanwhile, Mila's uncle and aunt threw parties with stolen money, wore fine clothes bought with stolen wealth, and acted like generous benefactors to the community. For 3 years, Nyangsa Kargyen tried to reclaim what belonged to her family. She appealed to village elders. She showed them her husband's will. She begged for justice. But corrupt people are often very good at covering their tracks. The uncle had convinced everyone that he was managing the estate responsibly, that Mila was too young to handle such wealth. Nobody wanted to get involved, especially when the uncle had all the money and all the power. With each rejection, Nyangsa Kargyen's heart grew darker. Then came the final humiliation. One market day, after her latest appeal was dismissed, Nyangsa Kargyen gathered her courage and confronted her brother-in-law publicly. In front of the entire village, she demanded he return what he had stolen. "You promised my dying husband," she cried. "You swore to protect his children." The uncle's response? He laughed. Actually laughed in her face. Then he had her dragged away and thrown into the dirt like garbage. As Mila watched his mother lying in the dust, his sister crying, and the villagers turning away in embarrassment, the boy he had been died. His childhood was over, his innocence was dead, and in its place a terrible anger began to grow. That night would change everything. That evening, after being humiliated in front of everyone she had once called friends, Nyangsa Kargyen sat in the corner of their borrowed hut. Her hands were dirty, her clothes torn, her pride shattered. But her eyes burned with a dangerous desperation. She looked at her teenage son, this boy who had once been destined for greatness, now reduced to rags and shame. "Mila," she said quietly, "I have tried everything, every legal path, every appeal, every plea for justice." Her voice grew harder with each word. "Your father's brother has stolen our life, our dignity, our future. and the law has abandoned us." Mila had never heard his mother speak like this before. It frightened him. "There is only one option left," she continued. "Revenge. Now you have to understand. This wasn't some movie moment where the hero decides to learn martial arts. This was medieval Tibet. When people talked about revenge, they meant darker arts. They meant magic, black magic. "I want you to learn sorcery," his mother said. "I want you to study the dark arts until you can destroy our enemies completely." Little Peta, who had been quietly mending clothes in the corner, gasped. "Mother, no," she whispered. "This isn't who we are. Father would never want this." But Nyangtse Kargyen was past caring what her dead husband would have wanted. "If you refuse," she said, staring directly into her son's eyes, "if you won't avenge your family, then don't call me mother anymore." The ultimatum hit like a physical blow. Your mother, the person who's supposed to guide you toward goodness, demanding that you become a killer. "And if you fail," she added, "if you're too weak to master the magic needed to destroy them, I will kill myself. I would rather die than live one more day in this humiliation." Mila felt the world spinning. On one side sat his little sister, tears streaming down her face, silently begging him not to do this terrible thing. On the other side sat his mother, consumed by rage and shame, demanding that he choose between becoming a murderer or losing his family forever. It's impossible to imagine making that choice. You're a teenager. Your family has lost everything. The legal system has failed you. Your mother is threatening suicide if you don't act. And deep down, aren't you angry too? Don't you want to see the people who destroyed your life suffer the way you've suffered? Mila looked at his sister's tears, then at his mother's burning eyes. He thought about scrubbing floors in his own home, of eating scraps while his uncle feasted on stolen wealth, of watching villagers look away when they saw his family's shame. The decision tore him apart, but in the end, he was still his mother's son. "I'll do it," he whispered. Peta collapsed in sobs, but Nyangtse Kargyen smiled for the first time in years. "There's a sorcerer named Yungten Trugyul," she said. "He's known throughout the region as a master of the dark arts. Go to him. Learn everything he can teach you." She paused and her voice became deadly serious. "And when you return, I want our family's enemies to pay for every day they've made us suffer." Mila nodded. His childhood was officially over. He was about to become a weapon. So Mila left everything he had ever known and set out to find the most dangerous man in Tibet. Some say the black arts he would study came not from Buddhism, but from Bon, Tibet's ancient shamanic tradition. Here, death wasn't feared. It was a power to be summoned. When he finally reached Yungten's dwelling, it looked ordinary enough. A simple stone house in a remote valley. But there was an aura of wrongness about the place. The air was too still. Birds didn't sing nearby. Yungten Trugyul was a small, quiet man with eyes that seemed to look right through you. He listened to Mila's story without interruption. The stolen inheritance, the public humiliation, the mother's ultimatum. When Mila finished, Yungten was silent for a long moment. "You want to learn sorcery for revenge," he finally said. "Do you understand what that means?" Mila nodded, though honestly, he had no idea. Real magic isn't about waving your hands and making things happen. Real magic is about making bargains with forces beyond human understanding. And those forces always demand payment. Mila asked what kind of payment. Sometimes your health, sometimes your sanity, sometimes pieces of your soul that you'll never get back. Yungten studied this desperate young man and spoke words that felt ancient. "When you deal in curses, boy, know that you must wear them home." But Mila was past caring about the cost. Every night, he thought about his mother's threat, about his sister's tears, about the humiliation that demanded justice. So his education in darkness began. For months, he studied forbidden texts written in languages that predated Buddhism's arrival in Tibet. He learned to draw protective circles with chalk made from bones. He memorized incantations that made his throat burn. But this wasn't like learning history or poetry. Every lesson felt like it was changing his core being. The rituals required him to embrace hatred, to nurture anger, to feed the darkest parts of his soul. He practiced on small animals first, mice, then birds, then larger creatures. Each death came easier than the last, and slowly, terrifyingly, he began to understand how much power he was gaining. The spirits responded to his calls. The protective circles held against forces that could drive men insane. His teacher watched with a mixture of pride and fear. Finally, the night came for the ultimate test. Mila stood in the center of a circle, drawn with ash from cremated criminals. Around him were symbols that hurt to look at directly. In his hands was a ritual dagger that seemed to absorb light. For hours, he chanted incantations in the ancient tongue. He called upon spirits whose names cannot be spoken in daylight. He offered pieces of his own life force as payment for what he was about to unleash. And then, an entity answered. The air became thick as water. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and Mila felt a presence so alien and hungry that every instinct screamed at him to run. But he didn't run. Instead, he made his bargain with darkness. When the ritual ended, Youngton looked at his student with genuine fear. "You now possess the power to summon death itself," he whispered. "But remember, the forces you now command don't distinguish between guilty and innocent. Once you unleash them, they will devour everything in their path." Mila gathered his few possessions and began the journey back to his village. He was no longer the broken boy who had left months ago. He was a weapon, and he was going home. When Mila returned to his village after months away, nobody recognized him at first. The magic had changed him. His eyes were colder, his face was thinner, his skin had a grayish pallor, and there was an aura about his presence that made people instinctively step away. Even little Peta, when she first saw him, whispered, "Brother, what have they done to you?" But he wasn't there for reunions. He was there to complete a promise, and fate, or maybe darker forces, had given him the perfect opportunity. His uncle's son was getting married. The entire extended family had gathered for a massive celebration. 35 people crowded into the house that had once belonged to Mila's father, eating food bought with stolen money, celebrating with wine purchased through stolen wealth. The uncle and aunt had no idea that death was watching them from the shadows. Mila found a secluded spot on the hillside overlooking the house. He could hear their laughter, their songs, their joy. For a moment, he hesitated. These weren't all evil people. Some were relatives who had come for a wedding, children who had done nothing wrong, young couples starting their lives together. But then he remembered his mother's ultimatum, the public humiliation, the stolen inheritance, the promise he had made, and any mercy he might have felt died. He began the ritual. First, he drew the protective circle with ash he had carried from Youngton's lair. Then he placed the cursed objects at specific points, each one consecrated with blood and hatred. As the sun set behind the mountains, he began to chant. The words that came from his mouth weren't human language. They were sounds that predated civilization, syllables that existed in the spaces between nightmares. With each verse, the air around him grew thicker, darker. And then he called upon the entity he had bargained with. "I offer you this feast," he whispered in the ancient tongue. 35 souls, in exchange for the justice that was denied to my family." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Inside the house, the celebration suddenly went quiet. Someone screamed that the walls were moving. Others pointed at shadows crawling across the ceiling like living things. But that was only the beginning. Mila raised his ritual dagger toward the sky and spoke the final words of the spell. What happened next defied every law of nature. The clear evening sky suddenly boiled with black clouds. Wind that hadn't existed moments before began howling. And from those impossible clouds came hail. But this wasn't ordinary hail. These were massive chunks of ice, the size of human skulls. Each one fell with impossible force, guided by supernatural hatred. The first hailstone smashed through the roof like it was made of paper. The second crushed a supporting beam. The third, and fourth, and dozens more, began systematically destroying the house. The sound was indescribable, cracking wood, screaming wind, human voices raised in terror. Inside, 35 people who had been celebrating moments before were now trapped in a nightmare. Some tried to run, others hid under tables. Nothing mattered. The supernatural storm was methodical, relentless, and standing in his ritual circle, Mila watched it all with cold satisfaction. This was justice. This was what his family's enemies deserved. The storm lasted exactly as long as the ritual required. When Mila spoke the final word, the wind stopped. The clouds vanished. The hail ceased falling. And in the sudden silence, nothing moved in what had once been a house. 35 people, gone. Only 2 figures emerged from the wreckage. His uncle and aunt, somehow spared by forces that Mila would never understand. Perhaps the spirits wanted them to live with the loss. Perhaps their suffering was more valuable than their deaths. The uncle and aunt staggered through the ruins, calling out names of family members who would never answer. Some say it was supernatural. Others believe a natural storm struck at the worst possible moment. But what matters is this. In the hearts of villagers, it became a curse. And Milarepa, its architect. But as Mila stood there, watching his uncle and aunt weep over the destruction, he felt no satisfaction. He felt empty when he returned to their small hut. His mother was waiting. "Did you do it?" she asked. He nodded. For 3 days she reveled in their enemy's destruction, but then she saw a young woman weeping over the ruins where her new husband had died. A husband whose only crime was being related to the wrong family. That's when the reality hit her. They hadn't punished the guilty. They had slaughtered innocents. The days after the massacre were the longest of Mila's life. He had expected to feel victorious, satisfied, complete. Instead, he felt hollow, like his essential self had been carved out and could never be replaced. The village was in mourning. 35 families had lost loved ones in a single night. Children cried for parents who would never come home. Parents wept over children who had died for someone else's crimes. And Mila, the architect of all this suffering, found that revenge tasted like ashes. One evening, as Mila sat staring at nothing, his little sister Peta approached him. Her eyes were red from crying, not for the dead, but for what her brother had become. "What have you become?" she whispered. The question hit him like a physical blow. What had he become? He had started as a victim, a boy whose family had been destroyed by greed and cruelty, someone deserving of sympathy and justice. But somewhere along the path of revenge, he had transformed into a destroyer. A killer, a destroyer of families, someone who had caused more suffering than had ever been inflicted on him. That night, alone in the darkness, Mila finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. 35 people, gone forever, because of him. Families destroyed because of his magic, a community traumatized because of his thirst for vengeance. In Buddhism, karma isn't moral accounting, it's momentum. And Mila's momentum was now deadly, rolling fast toward an even darker fate. He thought destroying the house would bring peace, but he had been chasing illusions, shadows that only deepened his pain. As Mila stood in the ruins of what his anger had created, as he felt the weight of 35 deaths crushing down on his soul, he looked up at the stars and whispered words that would later echo in his teachings. In the sky of mind, the storm clouds gather, but beyond them, the moon still shines. He paused and asked the question that would change everything. Can someone who has fallen this far into darkness ever find their way back to the light? Unknown to Mila, his question had already been heard. In the distance, a figure watched from the mountain path. An old monk with kind eyes, who had been traveling these valleys for many years, searching for students ready to learn the hardest lessons of all. The monk had witnessed the supernatural storm, had seen the destruction, had felt the young man's anguish rippling through the spiritual realm like waves. Most teachers would have turned away from such darkness, but this monk understood a truth that few others did. That sometimes, the deepest enlightenment comes from the deepest fall. His name was Marpa. and he had been waiting for someone exactly like Milarepa. The path to redemption was about to begin. Can someone who has committed terrible acts ever find redemption? Can a killer become a saint? That's the question we'll explore in part 2, when Mila meets the most demanding teacher in Buddhist history, a master who will break him down completely before building him into something extraordinary. But I want to know, have you ever done something you deeply regret? Something that made you question who you really are? Leave a comment below. Sometimes the path to healing starts with admitting we need it. If Milarepa's story resonates with you, if you believe that redemption is possible even for the worst among us, then subscribe and stay with us on this path. Because the light is coming, but not before more darkness.